The rusted iron gates of St. Jude's High School stood tall against the twilight sky, their intricate scrollwork resembling tangled vines waiting to snare anyone foolish enough to enter. It had been 10 years since the school closed its doors, 10 years since the tragedy that claimed the lives of 5 students in the basement boiler room. Tonight, it would claim more. The building itself seemed to slouch against the encroaching darkness, a decaying monument to a forgotten disaster. Wind whistled through shattered window panes, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of old blood and damp earth. It was Elias's idea. He was the kind of person who thrived on the forbidden, his curiosity a dangerous beacon that drew others in. Just a quick look around, he had promised, his eyes gleaming with a manic energy. A rite of passage before graduation. We'll be in and out in an hour. Alongside him were Maya, whose pragmatic nature constantly battled her anxiety, and Liam, the silent observer who only tagged along because he harbored a secret, unspoken crush on Maya. He couldn't bear the thought of her venturing into the dark alone, with someone as unpredictable as Elias. The trio slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, the overgrown weeds snapping beneath their boots like dry bones. The air grew noticeably colder the moment they crossed the property line, as if the school itself exhaled a frosty breath. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew, rotting wood, and forgotten memories. Flashlight beams cut through the suffocating darkness, illuminating rows of dust-covered lockers and peeling linoleum floors that were warped by years of water damage. Graffiti crawled across the walls like diseased veins, some of it angry, some of it nonsensical, but none of it welcoming. Maya pulled her jacket tighter, a cold dread settling in the pit of her stomach. This place feels wrong, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the distant, howling wind that rattled the main doors. Relax, Maya. It's just an old building, Elias scoffed, his flashlight dancing over a defaced bulletin board where faded flyers still advertised a homecoming dance from a decade ago. There's nothing here but rats and asbestos. But Liam wasn't so sure. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a face peering out from the shadows of an empty classroom. The silence wasn't empty, it felt expectant, like a predator holding its breath. Their exploration led them deeper into the labyrinthine corridors. The layout of the school seemed nonsensical in the dark, the hallways stretching on forever, twisting back on themselves in impossible ways. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic dripping of water echoing from an unseen source, a steady, metronomic plink, plink, plink that grated on their frayed nerves. As they reached the central stairwell, Elias paused, holding his hand up for silence. The air here was even colder, biting through their clothes. And then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic chanting seemed to drift up from the darkness below. It wasn't loud, but it was pervasive, vibrating through the concrete floor beneath their feet. "Did you hear that?" Liam asked, his voice trembling, the flashlight in his hand shaking slightly, casting a jittery beam across the crumbling drywall. Elias nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and an unhealthy excitement. "It's coming from the basement, the boiler room." Against Maya's desperate pleas, Elias began his descent. "Elias, stop, this isn't a game anymore," she hissed, grabbing his sleeve. But he shook her off, his gaze fixed on the darkness below. The stairs groaned under their weight, each step amplifying the eerie chanting. The words were indiscernible, a guttural, wet language that resonated deep within their chests, making their teeth ache. The temperature plummeted further, and their breath formed misty clouds in the beams of their flashlights. The heavy steel door to the boiler room stood slightly ajar. Elias pushed it open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest, a sound that seemed to echo for miles. Inside, the massive rusted boiler loomed like a dormant beast in the center of the cavernous room. But it wasn't the machinery that held their attention. In the center of the room, a large circle of freshly painted symbols was clearly visible on the concrete floor. The paint was a dark, glistening crimson, and it looked wet. At each point of the complex geometric design stood a thick, black candle, flickering wildly despite the lack of a breeze, casting long, distorted shadows against the soot-stained walls. And in the middle of the circle lay a massive, tattered leather-bound book, its pages open to a gruesome illustration of a flayed figure kneeling before a formless entity. The chanting grew louder, no longer an echo but a chorus of unseen voices surrounding them. The shadows cast by the candles seemed to detach themselves from the walls, taking on vaguely humanoid forms. They writhed and contorted, stretching impossibly long limbs toward the ceiling, their silent screams echoing directly into the trio's minds. "We need to leave. Now," Maya demanded, her voice cracking, her panic finally bubbling over. She grabbed Elias's arm, pulling hard. But Elias was mesmerized. He stepped away from her, crossing the threshold of the bloody circle. His eyes were locked on the book. "This is it," he whispered, his voice oddly calm, devoid of its usual bravado. "The ritual, it's real." He reached out, his trembling fingers tracing the ancient, jagged text on the open page. A sudden, violent gust of wind swept through the room, smelling of rot and ozone. It extinguished the candles instantly, plunging the room into absolute, suffocating darkness. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening, heavy silence that pressed against their eardrums. Panic erupted. Maya fumbled frantically for her flashlight, her hands shaking violently, dropping it once before managing to switch it back on. When the beam finally cut through the gloom, it illuminated a horrific sight. Elias stood in the center of the circle, his body rigid, his arms pinned to his sides. His head was thrown back, his eyes rolled completely back in his head, showing only the whites. Thick, black veins pulsed beneath his pale skin, spreading outward from his chest, crawling up his neck like a diseased ivy. "Elias!" Liam yelled, rushing forward. But as he reached the edge of the painted circle, an invisible force repelled him. It felt like hitting a solid wall of ice. He was thrown backward onto the cold concrete floor, the breath knocked out of him. Maya screamed as the shadows detached completely from the walls and descended upon Elias. They were like living smoke, swirling around him, their ethereal forms seemingly absorbing his life force. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his jaw unhinging unnaturally, his face contorted in an agony beyond comprehension. The black veins on his skin thickened, pulsating rhythmically. The realization hit Maya and Liam with terrifying clarity. The tragedy 10 years ago wasn't a boiler explosion or a structural failure. It was a sacrifice. And now, the school, or whatever lived beneath it, was claiming its next victims to sustain itself. The shadows, having consumed whatever they needed from Elias, turned their attention to Maya and Liam. His body slumped to the floor, a hollow, desiccated husk. The shadows moved with a predatory, fluid grace, their whispers filling the room, a cacophony of madness, despair, and a hunger that could never be sated. Liam scrambled to his feet, grabbing Maya's hand. "Run!" he bellowed. They bolted for the stairs, their flashlights forgotten on the floor in the ensuing chaos. They ran blindly through the pitch-black corridors, relying only on the faint moonlight filtering through the grime-caked windows. The shadows were in relentless pursuit. The whispers grew louder, no longer just noise but distinct voices, some mocking their fear, others mimicking the voices of their parents, their friends, twisting their reality and chipping away at their sanity. The lockers seemed to close in on them, the metal doors rattling violently as they passed. The walls appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting with a sinister, wet rhythm. The floor felt soft and spongy beneath their feet, like walking on rotting flesh. Every corner held a new terror, every shadow a lurking threat ready to pull them into the dark. Maya stumbled on a warped section of linoleum, her ankle twisting painfully with a sickening pop. She cried out, falling hard. Liam skidded to a halt and pulled her up, wrapping her arm around his shoulder, his own breath ragged and burning his lungs. They reached the main entrance, the heavy wooden doors and the brass push bars their only hope of escape. Liam threw his entire weight against the doors, but they wouldn't budge. They felt welded shut. He pushed again, screaming in frustration and terror, but it was useless. They were locked from the outside. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, drowning out Liam's shouts. The shadows converged upon them, their cold, necrotic touch seeping through their clothes and into their bones. Liam wrapped his arms tightly around Maya, turning his back to the approaching darkness, shielding her as best he could from the impending doom. As the shadows consumed them, pulling them down into the endless dark, the last thing they heard was Elia's voice. It wasn't his normal voice, but something distorted, deep, and demonic, echoing through the empty halls of St. Jude's High School. "The ritual is complete," the voice boomed, vibrating through the building's very foundation. "The school has been fed." And in the silence that followed, the old building settled, waiting patiently for its next meal.